at the Jindal Global Business School. I am Anirban, and I will be moderating this webinar, and we have four very, very eminent speakers who I will introduce in the next few seconds or so. So, a brief background about why we really wanted to host this seminar. First of all, let me tell you, this was entirely Dr. Chitrakalpa Sen's idea, and I cannot thank him enough for making this happen, along with Dr. Anuj Kapoor, who played a very, very important role in happening whatever happened so far. So we have very, very four eminent speakers here. First of all, we have Ronita Choudhuri, who is an assistant professor of Jindal Global Business School. And she also leads the startup JGU, which is a Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at JGU, as well as Blended Learning Entrepreneurship Program. Next, we have Professor Nilanjan Banik, who is from the School of Management at Bennett University in India. The third and the fourth participants are from the other part of the world, and thank you very much for waking up on a Saturday morning to be present in this webinar. First of all, we have Dr. Prasun Bhattacharjee, who is an associate professor of economics with the Eastern Tennessee State University in US, and Dr. Arindam Mandal, who is an assistant professor and chair of the economics department at Siena College in upstate New York in US. So over the next hour or so, the four speakers will throw light on some major issues on this COVID crisis, and each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and we'll keep the questions till the end. But before we begin, let me just clear one or two very basic housekeeping rules. One, all the participants except the speakers will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar, and their webcam will also be switched off. So I am requesting everybody to, other than the speakers and myself, the moderator, to please turn off your webcam and go into the mute mode. We can have all the interactions we can at the end of the webinar. Also, this webinar will be recorded and shared on the center's page. We will be providing a link, and whoever has missed the seminar or need to leave before the end of this webinar can definitely revisit our page and go through the webinar. So without further ado, let me just start off this webinar by asking Ronita a simple question, or might not be simple. Ronita is the best person to figure that out. So Ronita, the crisis, this COVID crisis, I am positive will change a lot of things. So do you think that it will change the existing form of work and workplace as we know it? Or do you have any other ideas in your mind?
Great. Well, first, thank you so much for holding this webinar. It's wonderful to have faculty from the US, faculty from India coming together on such a global issue, and where going forward, what the future holds is a much more integrated and distributed work environment, workplace, and work in general. There is a lot of discussion on what is the new normal, what's the new normal. I think what we have seen for sure going on through this COVID crisis is nothing brand new, but what we're seeing is an acceleration of a lot of trends that have already been there and have you've been working for a number of companies. It's just now that we all very quickly have to get up to speed on that. And what I'm talking about is, of course, remote work. That is what we're all doing right now, including myself. We're working from home, and while that was an adjustment for the first few weeks for a number of people, if you look at some of the larger companies today, and just to know, I will be speaking much more on the market and the industry perspective on these things. If you talk to lots of heads of companies right now, they've found that work from home is working for them. No pun intended. And so going back to commercial real estate is going to be a question. But what is it about remote work that does work? What we're seeing is that remote work actually does provide a tremendous amount of flexibility for people. for workers, for moms, for working parents, they get to spend a lot more time at home, while also getting their work done, and the companies in general are able to save on infrastructure costs. But that doesn't mean that it is easy. Remote work, as we're all experiencing, is, work was usually outside of the home, and home is something you come back to. Now with video conferences, the work is coming inside your home and being exposed to and your home is being exposed to the world. So that is an adjustment. And I think that's something that we all do have to get used to. What do our workplaces look like now when the house becomes our workplace? Do we set up different areas of the house? Are there some standardizations across offices? But more than that, what remote work, and I've been actually someone that has been working remotely by choice actually for about maybe 2 years or so now. But what remote work, the North Star of remote work, what it ends up getting to is what Mind Tools, a training enterprise, one of the best training enterprises in the UK, talks about, is a results-only work environment, which is very new for what we've considered corporate work or organizational work, where your colleague is right next to you, your manager is nearby, you can go and talk to them about projects you're working on, where there is a social aspect to it. But what remote work forces you to do is that your contributions are measured by the results, much more, much more than when you're in an office and you can share about different projects and collaborate, etc. So collaboration, despite there being certain tools that are of course making it easier, the idea that we need tools to collaborate goes to show that this is very different. And a results-only work environment, or what's short-term called a ROE, is very different because it comes with, of course, that inherent flexibility, right? No one's checking what you're doing at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And you don't need to sit at your desk until 10 p.m. at night getting your work done. If you finish your work, at 6 o'clock, then you're done. Or if you complete your work at 10 a.m., then you're done. And that's usually how a results-only work environment works. You really just look at results. Are you getting the work done on time per what you said and what you told your colleagues? What that does require is a tremendous amount of self-responsibility, professionalism, communication, especially if you're managing teams that are distributed across regions, across countries, across time zones. So making sure that you have people that you can trust to continue the work, even if you're sleeping or if you're not able to check on them in their cubicle. It also requires a tremendous amount of trust. You have to trust that the work is going to get done. Which is also going to require metrics, much clearer metrics than you've probably ever had to have before, because of performance measurements are just going to have to be stricter. You're not going to be quite sure where your employee is, how they're faring, and if they're even able to communicate problems to you as a manager. And then, of course, there has to be consequences for not completing the projects that you said you were going to do, or completing at the time that you said you were going to do, because especially if you're working in remote work, distributed teams, there has to be trust and there has to be consequences for if you are not living up to what you said you're going to do. It doesn't work that way, because now, you can't wander over to that cubicle. You can't quickly tap your colleague's shoulder and saying, what are you doing? You can't ask for help so quickly. So we all need to really stiffen up our communication skills, ask for help much more proactively, and continue to execute to what we say we're going to do, and make sure that it's quite clear. Especially for managing teams, it's not just about, did this XYZ person on my team get the project done, but do they have something else next lined up for them to do if they finished project 1? And I think all these 4 aspects, monitoring performance, trust, clear goals, professionalism, and strong communication, is really going to be the basis for how remote work operates going forward. Because I think this is just how work is really going to is just the adaptation post-COVID, and it's much faster than anyone expected. If we switch gears and we look at how entrepreneurship is going to fare, that's my sphere Myself, I have a Startup India recognized company here, and I currently do work with the entrepreneurs in the Startup JGU Center at Jindal. Entrepreneurship, and I'm going to speak mainly from the India context on this and looking at young people. I mean, how it's been so far is that, you know, a lot of the fantastic innovation that's come out of Silicon Valley has been life-changing, and I see a lot of young Indian entrepreneurs seeing that as the model for how entrepreneurship should be. However, the Silicon Valley model works in the Silicon Valley context, and one of the pillars of Startup JGU is to ensure that the entrepreneurship that is coming out of JGBS is entrepreneurship that is relevant for the Indian context. And this is where that idea of unicorn versus camels come out. And I tremendously agree with Alec Lazaro, a VC investor himself, who's written a lot of books on innovation outside of Silicon Valley. And, you know, in Silicon Valley, it's all about the unicorn. And, you know, if you talk to friends down in Bangalore, they talk about that as well, right? The unicorn. And the unicorn is a mythological animal. It's not something that's real, and it's very few companies ever get to that. What Alex Lazaro discusses is something called a camel. Now, why is that? The camel is a fascinating creature, and you might not give it enough credit, but what the camel is able to do is actually survive in very harsh environments, survive shocks. It's able to guzzle water when it's available, and when it's not, it's able to work through harsh environments, keeps moving, and it's able to sprint across deserts. And that model of creating startups, creating new companies that can survive, that are resilient, that aren't burning through cash or growing without, you know, without proper parameters, you know, that's not going to work. Camels are the future, I think, of widespread entrepreneurship in India. We need to be creating entrepreneurs and businesses that can survive through macroeconomic shocks like this, that have the cash at hand and aren't burning through it, and are able to get through, you know, 1 year of remote work and adapt accordingly and survive into the second year and survive into the third year. It's really about managing risk, especially in environments like India, where again, there's supply chain, there's macroeconomic shocks. The talent pipeline in itself is a challenge. And so, you know, often with entrepreneurs, in an Indian context, you know, the smart thing to do for businesses is to create a talent pipeline themselves. So when the education system isn't matching what roles need to be filled in these companies, it's can you create educational opportunities within your company to create that talent pipeline that's not only good for the entrepreneurship ecosystem, but it's also very strong for building candidates that are ready to join your company once they graduate from that program. So these are all sorts of things that entrepreneurs here have to take in mind. It's resiliency, being smart with your cash, providing products and services to the mass market. You know, Silicon Valley talks quite a bit about disruption. Now, to have disruption, there has to be something to disrupt. I think what we're seeing in India right now is entrepreneurs that are creating, right, that are formalizing previously informal sectors and are using transparency, technology, innovative ideas to improve, right? Improve those sectors, get things to the mass market, have easy payments, education, whatever it might be, but it's, in one way you can see that the impact is built into the operations, because it's not about disrupting and creating, breaking something, as Mark Zuckerberg quite famously is quoted for. You know, you don't break things. Here you're actually trying to create, you're trying to build, and you're going forward from there and making sure that your customers are protected, they're getting what they need, and their lives are getting better. This brings me to my last point, which is a new pilot program that we have launched at JGBS. I am leading it, it's called the RISE, and it's the Research and Innovation Semester for Entrepreneurs. So with a lot of these things in mind, we've created a semester where entrepreneurs are able to work on their startup idea for the full semester. There's no other classes. This is what we're working on. And what initially did start as a blended online offline learning pedagogy back in January, we've now of course gone fully online. And thankfully, because so much of it was digital through a personalized educational dashboard we created, that transition was quite seamless. However, what we're looking at now, post-COVID, is that a lot of these entrepreneurs are actually intrapreneurs. The reality is that innovation hasn't hit the family businesses as hard, maybe for a good thing, as hard yet. And a lot of these students are, you know, children of family businesses that they are slated to take over. And the innovation hasn't penetrated into a lot of these legacy businesses, especially around manufacturing and supply chain. So what we're looking at is building these students as entrepreneurs within their family businesses, having them test out new ideas. How can they use technology? How can we have personal development programs for them to help build up their arguments, build up their confidence, their presentation skills, the ability to influence and manage others, and create a learning environment that is not only realistic, but it's actually efficient for them to learn to then go and implement into their businesses. So that is RISE, a very quick brief on that. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or if anyone would like to reach out to me directly, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronita. It was a wonderful talk, and I'm sure I can speak for everybody else in the audience as well as myself when I say that we learned a lot. And two things that kind of came out was, I'll come to the second one, I'll come to the work from home later, is the resiliency part. As someone who has been associated with operations and supply chain, yes, resiliency is the way to go, not only for the supply chain, but also for the organization, especially in times of a serious pandemic as COVID-19 and the situation that has affected the global business operations, human lives. Why stick to business only post this pandemic era? And the second thing is definitely the work from home. Yes, work from home is becoming the new normal. For someone like me who hated working from home, I am also adjusting to it, to this new normal. And as Ronita mentioned, we will be seeing a sea of change in the nature of work, workplace, entrepreneurship, etc. But on the other extreme of this same economy, the impact of this crisis on the working poor is turning out to be devastating. The news that we get, the pictures that we see are morbid, to say the least. We are already seeing a traumatic impact on the crisis on the Indian migrant laborers. And of course, in this case, the work from home is an entity that's not in their dictionary, is a word that's not in their dictionary. And they are severely, severely bearing the brunt of the lockdown. So in this context, I would love to ask Nilanjan to throw some light on this issue.
Hi, Anirban, can you see me?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. Okay, great. So basically, it's a very important question which you have asked. And first of all, hi everyone. And so let me start with some background, and this is looking at the data collected by NCAER. This is the income household data. And what the data is saying that the median income for India is close to 3 lakh rupees per year. And if I'm looking into the per capita average income, it is close to 1,60,000 rupees per capita per annum. And 80% of the population in India actually have income less than this average annual per capita income, which is 1,60,000. And if you're in the top 1% of the income population, all you have to do is to have an annual income more than 15 lakhs rupees per capita per annum. So you can very well understand from these numbers in terms of distribution of income how skewed we are. Now, when we are talking about the coronavirus, some of the other things which you have come to know, and let me again throw in some numbers. if I'm looking into the number of death as a percentage of people getting affected, across the world, there is a huge variation. Like what we see in terms of income distribution for India, we also find, if I'm looking into the number of people who are dying as a percentage of total people getting affected, also varying quite a bit if you look at the standard deviation. For instance, in US, as we are talking about, as of now, there are close to 0.9 million people who got affected, out of which you have close to 53,000 people dying. So as a percentage of total number of people getting affected, for US it is 5.7. For United Kingdom, it is 13.6. For Italy, it's 13.5. The good news is for India as of now, if I'm looking into the number of deaths as a percentage of total number of people getting affected, it is only 3.1. So if we were to control for the population size, the best way to look into the figures would be to compare Indian states. For instance, if I'm looking into Rajasthan, which is more or less similar to that of the UK, you will find that for Rajasthan, the number of death as a percentage of total affected from coronavirus is 1.4, as opposed to UK, which is 13.6. If I'm looking into UP and Bihar combined, you will find that this number are only 1.4, as opposed to US 5.7 death. So it's kind of counter argument, So because US, UK, they spend close to 6 to 10% of their national income. Actually, for US, it's actually 16% of the national income they spend on healthcare infrastructure. And for UK, they spend close to 8% of the national income on their health infrastructure. For India, if you take states and center combined, the figure comes to around 3.89. And if I'm looking only at the central government, the figure is only 1.5% of the GDP, which they are spending on health infrastructure. So what is surprising is, in spite of India spending so less, yet in terms of the number of people dying as a percentage of total number of affected persons is quite low, And this number is true across some of the other countries. For instance, if I'm looking into the countries with similar level of income pattern as in India, for instance, Bangladesh. For instance, if I'm looking into Ethiopia, for instance, if I'm looking into Tanzania, there also you'll find that although our per capita income is quite low, for Ethiopia, Tanzania, Bangladesh, the level of mortality is quite low, as opposed to what we are seeing in the context of USA, UK, Italy, or Spain, or some of the developed countries. So the first thing which comes to our mind is, why is it the case? And if you talk to some of the critics, they would argue that we are actually testing less number of people. But even if I'm looking at death as the total number of deaths, and try to do a counterfactual experiment, which is, if I'm looking into the total number of deaths between 2018 and 19 and 2019 and 20, you will find that not too much of difference is happening in the context of India, as opposed to what we are seeing in the context of developed countries. And one reason for this, or maybe two reasons for this, has to do with the fact maybe for countries like India, Tanzania, or Nigeria, or Bangladesh, we have much younger group of population which are more immune to handle this virus, as opposed to what we see in the context of developed countries. Now, why I'm telling you all these statistics? For the simple reason is, here we are talking about a very important condition, which is lockdown. Because I just now shared with you this number that 80% of Indian population are actually having income less than 1,60,000, and these are the population who are mostly into migrant labor or agricultural labor. So when the lockdown happened, the first thing which is quite natural instinct for them is they went back to their native state. Now, another important thing, I don't know whether you guys have noticed or not, is unlike other type of diseases, for instance, if I'm talking about tuberculosis, if I'm talking about cholera, if I'm talking about, let's say, pneumonia, or even road accident, you will find that compared to what we are seeing death in corona, compared to these other diseases, are quite low. But the important point to note here is, whenever we are talking about tuberculosis, whenever we are talking about diphtheria, whenever we are talking about measles, whenever we are talking about pneumonia, so these are typically happens for the people in the lower income strata. So the basic difference between what we are seeing in the context of corona vis-a-vis these other diseases with much more death rate compared to what we see in the context of corona is, for corona, you have this impacting across the income distribution. So the corona is in that way is a very level. It's actually operating on a very non-discriminatory fashion, if I may say so. Because again, if I'm looking into the number of vaccination for be it for measles, BCG, or diphtheria, you will find that most of us who belong to the middle income or the higher income category, we actually ensure that our kids are vaccinated properly. And because of that, the outcome is very seldom you will hear your friend or people from your level of income background actually suffering from cholera, pneumonia, or any other this communicable kind of diseases, which is not the case for COVID, because in COVID, the rich and the upper class, they don't know how to handle it because it is actually impacting all of them. And when we are talking about the livelihood, this is something which Anirban mentioned, although he hates working from home, but the good part is he was able to shift his offline duty into online duty. The same is for me. I mean, I'm just now talking with all of you over online. So for most of the people who are in the banking profession, who are teachers, who are, let's say, IT professionals, for them it's not too much of a problem with the difference in their livelihood. Their livelihood is still continuing. But for this 80% of the people category, there are close to 120 million migrant workers in India. Most of them are actually construction workers or agricultural laborers or helpers in a restaurant and things like that. For this type or for this group of people, who otherwise, and that's why I shared the data about the death rate in India, who otherwise may be asymptomatic in terms of they are not having any symptom and they are perfectly fine, but they are not able to work, and that's a problem. And so what I'm suggesting is, if I again look into the district level data, you will find close to now 60% of the Indian district out of 650 district are the ones which are kind of getting impacted because of the spread of coronavirus. The remaining district are what the government is calling as green zone, meaning that it is not that much impacted. Now, if you see in what way this group of people who are in the lower echelon of the income strata are getting affected, first of all, they are moving into value added into some services with a lower value addition. For instance, the guy who is to drive, let's say, auto, or who is to run his small restaurant. Now the restaurant or the auto driver profession as a profession is closed. Or for that matter, the guys who are in the business of who work as a decorator for any function, so their business is gone. So what we are seeing is most of these auto drivers, they have taken an alternate profession of as a delivery boy. I was told by some of my friends in Calcutta is some of this decorator, they have now transformed their this business and they're running salon. They have transformed into barber. So why I'm saying that this is actually a fall in value addition, because as an auto driver, the amount of earning you are having is certainly higher than what you are going to earn now as a delivery boy, because that's not your profession. Or for that matter, so we are seeing a shift. Not only the economy is contracting, but also there is a shift in activity to a much lower value-added jobs, compared to what you were doing earlier, you know. So I was again checking at some data during 2008 financial crisis. In terms of value addition, our economy contracted by close to 12%. And this time, within this span of 3 or 4 months, from the time the corona thing first came on the news, starting January, if you look into the data, the real value addition of our economy has contracted by more than 20%. So something, what happened during the context of US financial crisis, 12%, now within a span of very few months, you see a big contraction happening in terms of the gross value addition, which is happening in the economy. And of course, all of you know that even IMF is now projecting an income growth of only 1.9% as opposed to our initial projection of 4.5% during later half of the previous year. You know, so that's a big contraction. And who are the people who are going to get impacted most? These are the people who are in the business of this hand-to-mouth profession, you know, be it the laborers, be it the restaurant, small-time restaurant operators, be it, let's say, someone who was driving, you know. So ideally, what the government should do, and there are some precedents, you know, if you look into Orissa and Kerala, this has been touted in the most of the newspaper. What they are doing is they are trying to target the people who are actually migrant labor and who has lost their livelihood. And what is happening is the government is ensuring that the public distribution system is operating properly. And also they are getting access to this universal basic income, that 2,000 rupees what the central government has promised to give to them. They are getting it, you know, and that's why the Kerala model and the, in fact, for the Kerala model, they are also doing lots of more testing compared to Orissa. And on the other extreme, you have the Bhilwara model, which is a district in Rajasthan, which basically performed this lockdown in the most stringent fashion as possible, you know. So to kind of give you some, to wrap it up, so we'll have to look into this lockdown with a human face. We have to ensure that we are reaching to the target group, because this belongs to 80% of the Indian population. We have to ensure that their livelihood is taken into account. And only then I think we will do a good job, because this group of people are the least one who are going to die, if I may say so, from this coronavirus episode. So I'll stop here. We'd be happy to take any question you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nilanjan. And it was a wonderful and an amazing talk. Of course, I'm sure that based on what Ronita said, based on what you said, a lot of questions are lining up already. But however, as I said at the beginning of this webinar, we'll take the questions at the end. So without further ado, let's go to the third speaker of the session, Dr. Prasun Bhattacharjee. Prasun, my question to you is that we are already seeing healthcare facilities, even in the advanced economies, completely overwhelmed by the pandemic, by COVID-19. And we know that countries like India have only a very small fraction of the GDP allocated to the healthcare. So do you think that this crisis would force us to take a closer look at these priorities?
Okay, thank you, first of all, Anirban and Chitrakalpo, for inviting me to this webinar. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and share my slides. That way, it'll be easier for everyone, I guess, to follow what I'm talking about. So Anirban, can you see my slides? I mean, everyone can see those?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. I can see your slides.
Okay, thank you. So let me just go ahead and...
Yeah, I will mute myself till your presentation ends.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll basically talk about three things which probably are learning experiences from this pandemic that we are facing currently. And this being what Anirban just pointed out, we have to rethink, countries have to start rethinking that how they allocate resources in this very critical sector, which is the healthcare sector, and then restructuring some of the fundamentals of the healthcare system, as well as what the current mortality numbers are really telling us in terms of the extent of this pandemic, and do we need to look more into this kind of numbers. So starting with my first point, so when we talk about whether we are going to spend more resources on the healthcare sector, then definitely that implies that we have to extract resources from some other sectors, because we have limited resources. So clearly we have to undergo some kind of sacrifice in some other sectors of the economy. And that brings us to the point that that's a costly affair. So keeping that in mind, I think probably it will be a good idea if we can take a look into a pandemic of this extent and see what kind of costs a country is kind of incurring when we have such a pandemic. And broadly speaking, there are two types of costs. One is the medical cost and the economic cost. Now, the medical cost is obviously the kind of obvious one. You have diagnosis costs as well as treatment costs, which includes masks, testing kits, medical personnel, personal protective equipment, ICU ventilators, all that we are talking about. But a significant part of this cost of the pandemic is economic costs. And there are two types of economic costs that we need to look into. One is long-term kind of economic cost. And by long-term, we are looking into long-term and short-term. So first we look into the supply side of the country and what kind of economic costs we are facing because of the supply side problems. So one is, remember that we are always kind of looking at the well-being of a country from the productive capacity of a country. So if a country has more productive capacity, if we can produce more goods and services, then clearly, we can enjoy more goods and services, and we have a better, well-being. We have a better standard of living. So what's happening with this kind of a pandemic? First of all, we have people dying. So there are people who are part of the workforce. So if they're dying, then clearly the country is losing its productive workforce. So that's a loss of long-term economic productivity. And also there are some businesses which will be closing or forced to close because there are some businesses which are deemed as non-essential during this crisis. So for example, if you need to go to a haircut salon, you cannot go to a salon now. So if they cannot pay rent, if they cannot earn revenue, they'll be permanently closing. So again, that's losing productive capacity of the country long-term. And then you have some short-term productivity losses as well. And the short-term losses are coming from the fact that because of social distancing, lockdown, businesses are obviously operating in shorter hours. So grocery stores are probably opening not to the full hours, but limited hours. Although there's a demand, but still they are not being able to open because of restrictions. So that's a short-term productivity loss. And also a lot of workers are working from home. So they're not probably doing, what Ronita actually talked about, they're not probably working 9-hour shifts or 10-hour shifts. So they're not even doing their full productive capacity. So that way we are also losing some kind of short-term productive losses because of this disruptions. So that's the supply side. Now, next thing we need to look into is the demand side. So remember, why the demand side is equally important, because if we are not buying things, then clearly companies won't be producing as much. And if they don't produce as much, they'll shut down and they will hire workers. And clearly that's a vicious circle. So we'll have more unemployment and so on. So because of a pandemic, we'll have, again, demand loss. One is the short-term demand loss because of lockdown. So since, we cannot probably go to the stores we cannot buy as much as we would have bought during a regular time, but because of the pandemic, because of lockdown, we cannot do that. So there's a short-term demand loss. And we have reduced access to businesses, because you'll be stopped by the cops and asked if you're going to buy essential service or not, things like that. And then you have a long-term or permanent loss of demand as well because of mortality, because a lot of people will be dying from this pandemic and they are potential buyers. So if they die, they won't be buying in the future when things get back to normal. They won't be able to buy enough. And they won't be part of the, the buyer pool actually. And also people will lose jobs. So lost income, lost jobs will also have a permanent damage on the demand side of the country. So looking at both the demand and supply side, we can see that this kind of a pandemic entails a huge kind of economic cost, okay, which is a very significant cost actually. So that brings us to the point that given this fact, should we actually allocate more resources in the healthcare sector? Because we can see the cost of this, and now we have to look into is this cost sustainable, or should we rather rethink and probably spend more to avoid this kind of a big, economic damage or, overall cost to the economy? Now, having said that, first of all, the most important part is that, I think that one of the main complaints we are seeing all over the world is that, countries don't have adequate supplies to testing kits. They don't have adequate supplies to ventilators, which is so critical. So that kind of infrastructure, I think countries need to definitely invest in. But some people might say, okay, that might be required during a pandemic, but what about regular times? We might have an excess capacity. But I think that kind of an excess capacity makes sense here. The reserve capacity is just like if you're going to sporting events, I mean, they have, people on the bench, like reserve players. So similar kind of a sentiment has to work here. So that's one thing. The other thing is if you look at, some developing countries like India, I mean, we already have critical shortage of healthcare. And that's why I personally believe that the move by the Indian government with this early shutdown or lockdown definitely was a very smart move. Now, I do support that. But having said that, I also think that, if infections spread like that in India, I mean, we are not even equipped to, respond to such a big kind of problem, which the developed countries already are, having a hard time, dealing with. But at the same time, I think lockdowns are not the answer. I mean, how long can we have the lockdown? And that's why I'm saying that the response should not be a Rip Van Winkle kind of a response. So it's, I mean, ideally speaking, in an ideal world, if we could all fall asleep for maybe 2 months, 3 months, and then wake up and everything, all virus is gone. But, I mean, that's not possible. I mean, you can imagine the kind of damage. I mean, I understand the sentiment. I mean, we have to save lives, but there has to be a balancing act. I mean, we have to obviously, act for, fast and, have these lockdowns, but probably you can reduce the extent of the lockdowns if we have, mass testing kits and so on. And that brings me to a article that I recently came across, which I'll kind of show you. This was published, I think, 4 or 5 days back in the New Yorker. And actually this kind of, captured the sentiment which I'm presenting here, is that it's not too late to go on offense against the coronavirus. So you can be playing defense, but for how long? I mean, you cannot just keep everything, everything locked up for 3 months, 4 months. I mean, the damage is huge. But at the same time, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be doing that. So how to balance that? Okay, so that's very important. So we cannot play the defensive game here. We also have to play an offensive game. We have to have mass testing available. We have to have, contact tracing done. So those kind of things have to be, handled by the government, but we need an infrastructure for that. I mean, that's the most important part. And if you look at some of the countries like South Korea, Germany, who actually, handled the problem really well compared to some other countries, they acted really fast and they had mass kind of testing kits available. So they tested everyone, they did the contact tracing. I mean, China also did that as well. Okay, so that's one thing. And also, it's not about only spending, because Nilanjan actually made a point, and Anirban also made that point, that US typically spends a lot. I mean, they already spend 17% of their GDP on healthcare, whereas India spend about 3%. Now, by spending, I'm not talking about only public health spending, but this is all kind of expenses that go on to healthcare. So if your insurance pays or you pay out of pocket, doesn't matter, but the total spending, out of total GDP. So that's a huge percentage. But the problem with the US healthcare system is there are a lot of inefficiencies, there are a lot of waste. I mean, people talk about administrative paperwork, that kind of waste. So we also need to look into the, healthcare system themselves, and where we are spending, we have to probably also not spend too much. If we want to allocate more resources, we can probably also, have some efficiency gains if we can make the systems more efficient. If we can cut down the waste. So it's not about just a magic number of dollar spending, but also we have to make things more efficient. Okay, so that's very important. And that's what I'm saying. It has to be a balancing act with a focus on efficiency. And if you just look at some numbers, for example, if you look at the US stimulus package, I mean, that was like 10% of GDP, the $2 trillion package. So if we are spending like 10% of GDP within a span of 3 months, I mean, it's not over yet. We don't know what else is coming. We don't know the total damage. We don't know the total impact in dollar terms. So if we're already spending 10% to, contain the virus, And if we are spending 17% overall, not for coronavirus, but overall in the healthcare system, then obviously we need to take a look into the system, what's going on, because who knows, by the time this is over, we might have spent 25% of GDP. Then when a pandemic hits, if we are spending 25%, why not restructure our healthcare system and probably allocate more resources and spend maybe 20% instead of 17 if things can be handled in a better way. So all I'm saying is that the lockdowns are unnecessary, but definitely you can balance probably things in a better way if you can have the lockdowns for 2 weeks instead of 2 months and act fast with proper kind of equipment, medical supplies, and so on. That would be obviously a smarter move, I guess, and that will mitigate some of the damage that we are seeing. Okay, so that's one thing. The next thing is, I also believe that countries need to become more self-reliant when it comes to critical medical supplies, because if you're depending on China, the timing is very important here. Like, you need access to ventilators, you need access to kits. So when a pandemic of this nature hits a country, then obviously they will give priority to their citizens. So China will give their priority to the citizens. So by the time you receive those critical medical supplies, it might be too late to respond. So I think countries also need to focus on critical kind of equipment, critical drugs, pharmaceuticals, and so on, and they might rethink of producing them within the country itself. And that might also open up new job opportunities, who knows, a new economic sector. So these are things to be considered, I think. And finally, I believe that public policy needs to be based on a more all-inclusive cost-benefit framework. So the way public policy mostly works is we look at the cost of building a hospital and what kind of benefits we might have, looking at mortality rates and life expectancy and disease patterns and so on. But these are huge uncertain events. So those uncertainties need to be fed into those kind of models, those kind of quantitative methods that we are using to do this cost-benefit analysis. Okay, my next point would be, Anirban, I hope I am sticking to the time.
Yeah, you have maybe around 5 minutes more to wrap up.
I'll try my best. Okay. So
okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. My second point is also around the same thing. So this is about restructuring. So I guess, again, the problem I said that we have critically ill patients, we have to act fast. I mean, the virus spreads so fast. So that's why countries also need to introduce and strengthen, disease surveillance mechanisms, like, for example, electronic health records. So when people reach to the doctors, if they know that somebody has a heart problem, they can act fast. So that's very important. I mean, some developed countries have those already, but there's a lot of, data issues, data privacy issues. So we need to probably relax regulations to act more effectively, or let the physicians act more effectively if you already know who have health issues and health problems and so on. And medical education, I think, needs to adopt a multidisciplinary approach, because when things are stretched, for example, when we have medical systems that are stretched, we can probably have the nurses and pharmacists, if they have a more broader medical knowledge, they might be able to help the less critically ill patients, and then the doctors can probably deal with the more complex cases. And finally, I think this also requires for us to rethink on a government-sponsored universal health insurance program. I mean, that's been on the table for years in the US. I mean, it's still going on. But countries have shown who have universal health insurance programs, their citizens overall have better health, I mean, better immunity and so on. So that's very important, I guess. And also with a crisis like that, if you don't have insurance, you might think about twice about going and seeing a doctor or getting tested, because by the time the government comes up and says things are free, the time has passed. So, the timing is very important here. So if you have access to health insurance, you can probably respond early to those kind of signs. And finally, my last point, which is looking at the mortality numbers. So, we are looking at a lot of mortality numbers being reported, but obviously, I mean, still they're at the early phases. But we shouldn't, forget one thing, which is that we have a lot of critically ill patients who might require a heart surgery, or who might need a knee replacement and things like that, who are not getting access to adequate healthcare at this point of time, and timely access. Because COVID is now the primary kind of, is the priority. So they're taking a back seat. So that's one problem that we are facing. So we might see more mortality happening there. At the same time, dentist office, eye hospitals, I mean, some of those are closed. So, people might not be critically ill, but people might lose, timely access or timely diagnosis, and that might lead to blindness and things like that. I mean, things can get bad. And also people who have like chronic illnesses like blood pressure or, diabetes, because of all this lockdown, they're not getting timely access to medication. So we need to look at the bigger picture. It's not only COVID, but it has, a lot of overflow on other kind of people as well. Now, some people are talking about suicide rates. I mean, economic downturns or hardships typically increase suicide rates. I mean, that's true, but there is a mixed kind of result. Since during economic downturns or recessions, I mean, a lot of literature has seen that since during these times people travel less to work, there are less road accidents, there are less occupational hazards, there's less stress or less smoking, drinking. So overall death rates actually fall during economic downturn. So we might get mixed results, we don't know. But this is a different level of problem. Like we have unprecedented measure like isolation, social distancing, quarantine. I mean, we have never seen that in our lives. And also we are not even certain when things will resume. We don't know if things will get back to normal when. So that can also lead to mental health problems. And but on the contrary, you can say that people spending more time with their family and things like that might make them happier. So we don't know. I mean, there are some reports which are saying that divorce rates will increase because couples will be spending more time together. So we don't know what will happen. But my point is, again, with stretched healthcare systems, since we don't have the infrastructure at place, this kind of mental health problems won't be able to we won't be able to respond to them as we would be able to respond to them in normal times. So that's a problem. And finally, people who have health insurance because of jobs, if they're losing their jobs, they will lose access to healthcare. So that's a problem. And also in countries like India, poor countries, I mean, we're looking a lot of people who are going hungry. So we might also see hunger related deaths. So the mortality numbers are yet to be seen. It's just not COVID, but if we sum up everything, probably those numbers will look really, really grim or really, really bad. So okay, I'll finish my talk there. Thank you, Anirban.
Thank you so much, Prasun. And it was really a very thoughtful discussion or a thoughtful talk on your side. And I really like the post from New Yorker where it said that go on the offensive with more and more testing. And as you have very correctly pointed out, South Korea was one of the first countries to do that and probably eliminate the virus or minimize the virus. It's not eliminated, I'm sorry, to a large extent. And also the balancing act as well as resiliency. Basically piggybacking on what Ronita said right at the beginning of the talk, of the webinar, resilient organization, resilient supply chain would definitely go a long way in probably minimizing, if not eliminating this crisis that we are having, especially business and economy wise. So now I will ask, but having said that, we will indeed see a lot of changes happening in the near future when this crisis is over. And I think, I might be wrong, but I think that one of the biggest impact of this crisis will be on the labor market. Now, my question to Arindam, the final speaker, is that you are a labor economist. So how do you think that this is going to impact the labor market and what should be the policy response?
Thank you, Anirban. I would like to thank JGU. Would like to thank Chitrakalpa and Anirban to put it together. This is a very nice panel and I learned a lot till now from other three speakers. But before I go into details, let me share a screen that will be easier for me to explain what's going on. Okay, so the talk I'm going to focus on is on the impact on labor market, and I'll try to focus from a global perspective. I think that's very important because a lot of things are happening locally within a border right now, but what the impact would be at the global level. Now, before even I go into details, let's try to answer some major questions because that questions would help us to understand what kind of changes is going to happen in the labor market. So first major question is, what's the extent of the economic crisis? Second is, what's the nature of recovery? Are we talking about quick recovery? Are we talking about slow recovery? Then based on these factors, it will determine what's the impact on the labor market. And then I'll touch upon some of the effective policy responses. So let me first get into the extent of the economic crisis. Now, there are possible channels. Now, what are the possible channels through which COVID-19 is impacting the labor market? And the first thing that comes to our mind is this is nothing but an aggregate supply shock, which essentially increases the cost of hiring or cost of business, and that leads to resulting unemployment. Now, if we compare this to prior crises like 2008 financial crisis, which was essentially a demand shock. In the Indian context, perhaps the closest thing I can think about right now about supply shock is comparable to the demonetization in India that happened. But demonetization was a much slower version of this pandemic. This is the literally demonetization on steroids, if you want to see in a perspective. Now, and also another interesting thing about this aggregate supply shock is that it disrupts the labor market. It doesn't disrupt or destroys capital, unlike hurricane or flood, which are also supply shocks, but it never destroyed but this COVID doesn't destroy the capital. Second important thing is how it's going to change the consumer preferences. Is it we are in a kind of cusp where people start thinking or consuming differently? That will impact the labor market. And finally, it's going to evaluate the country risk. We are already talking about shifting our supply chains to some other countries because most of the stuff, this COVID started in China, and there are already talks about, are we relying too much on China? Should we move to other countries to get our supplies? Another problem is that we even don't know the extent of this crisis. All we have is initial data from over the last 2 months. But the initial data are not very supporting, or it's not very encouraging. For example, in US, in a span of 6 weeks, the jobless claim is up to 26 million. And the estimates right now is that US unemployment rate is up to 20%. About 2 months back, US unemployment rate was 3.5%. That's a huge increase in a period of just 6 weeks. In a world scale, there's a 32% decline in world merchandise trade. Obviously, there's supply chain disruptions, and that's showing up in the world trade context. Even within a domestic economy, for example, in China, within a period of 2 months, there's an 80% decline in car sales. And all these are going to have a huge impact on the labor market. And I can probably say that right now we are in a recession, though officially it has not been declared yet. And some economists are arguing that perhaps this is comparable to the Great Depression, which was much worse than the Great Recession we faced about 10 years back in 2008. Now let's talk about the recovery. Okay, fine, we are on some kind of downward path. What kind of recovery we are looking at? And that's the challenging picture. It's very difficult to predict the nature of the economic recovery because of COVID. Best case scenario would be a V-shaped recovery, which basically means that a quick downfall and a quick recovery in the labor market. However, more likely scenarios based on the data and based on some of the experts, recovery might be U-shaped or W-shaped, which is essentially talking about slow recovery in the labor market. It perhaps going to stay. For example, Center for Disease Control in US recently said that this pandemic might come back more vigorously over the next upcoming winter in the north. If that happens, then we are looking at a W-shaped kind of recovery. Perhaps the worst case is that, and let's hope it's not, it's an L-shaped recovery. There's no recovery, which means that labor market remains in the slack for an extended period of time. But most of the policymakers are thinking L-shaped is not a possibility because it's more an aggregate supply shock and it's not a demand shock. Now let me get into what's the impact on the labor market. Obviously, impact would depend on the nature of the recovery. Are you going to have a U-shaped or W-shaped or L-shaped or V-shaped? And my thinking is this, it is most probably U or W-shaped recovery, which means that it will be slow recovery. It will not be a quick recovery, which many economists were thinking initially. However, there are some signs that certain countries, especially South Korea, they are seeing some kind of quick recovery. But that doesn't seem like a possibility, especially for bigger economies like the United States or India or even for China. Now, if we are looking forward to a slower recovery or U-shaped or W-shaped recovery, there are two kinds of implications for that for the labor market. One is short-term versus long-term implications, and also there are global versus local implications. So first, I'm going to touch upon short-term versus long-term implications on the labor market. Obviously, in the short term, first dramatic impact would be unemployment. And there are some estimates that in some countries, this unemployment can go as high as 30 to 35% unemployment rate. Just to give you the context, during the Great Recession in US, unemployment rate barely touched 10%. So because of this pandemic, we are basically looking at almost 3 to 4 times more unemployment rate in a countries like the US. And I would not be surprised if similar things happens in other countries, because US often leads the whole world in terms of demanding goods and services, which kind of runs the factories in some of the developing countries. If US stops demanding those goods, it obviously can lead to a higher unemployment in some of the developing countries as well. Second concern is that this negative supply shock can easily transition into a negative demand shock, and which can make recovery extremely difficult because it can then prolong for a very long time. And also this short-term job separations due to unemployment may make recovery difficult due to labor market frictions. For example, it's not easy to rehire your cook once you have fired your cook. So the question is that how long companies are going to pay individuals who are unable to work remotely. And if they fire them, and when the economy restarts, how easy it will be for them to rehire those people. And there's a good chance they may not be able to rehire them again because they might have moved on. Then it's a huge problem for the employers to find the right match for their jobs, which kind of explains the labor market frictions and its impact on the employment. Now there are longer term impacts. For example, it can make certain kind of jobs obsolete because of longer spells of unemployment. We have seen in at least US data has shown after 2008 crisis, the duration of unemployment increased drastically. And also there was a huge drop in the labor force participation because a lot of people are discouraged to work. And if this pandemic continues for an extended period of time, we might end up seeing a long spells of unemployment and a drop in labor force and also de-skilling of workers. And that's a huge would be a huge structural change for a country. It also can create an incentive for firms to go for more automation. Obviously, a robot doesn't get infected by a virus, right? But human beings does. And so it might create incentives for firms to go for automation. And also many of the central banks are providing cheap money. If these firms can get cheap money, they might invest more on automation than on human beings. Also, there's a chance that it might lead to a demand for gig economy workers like Uber drivers or DoorDashers food delivery service. That's another change perhaps might happen, because one of the most encouraging places where the jobs are maintained are Amazon deliveries or online deliveries. The question is that, do we really want to go for those kind of changes in the economy? Then obviously there are question of negative impact on labor morale and productivity. We all know like this kind of pandemic has a serious impact on productivity, as Prasun just mentioned in the previous discussion. That's a real concern. Suicide rates typically might go up because of this. So we don't know yet, but that data will show us in future. And this can be the issue of rising income inequality. Already there are concerns about access to healthcare. We have seen scenarios where the rich people have been able to fly off to much safer places, but people who are daily wage earners are kind of stuck in the cities. And this kind of scenario and this kind of grave inequality can undermine the democratic values and may give rise to authoritarianism. Already there are talks about government using cell phone private information to track individuals. Now, what stops these governments to use for other purposes in the future? So those will be a great, important change that perhaps we need to be mindful of. Now let me focus on the local versus global impacts on the labor market. So locally, I believe like what's going to happen, certain kind of industries like airline, retail sales, hotels and restaurants, tourism will be impacted adversely. And often many of these are very local. For example, tourist towns will be devastated because nobody will be going there. Another important thing is going to happen is that attractiveness of bigger cities for people to work in there. Generally, cities like New York, New Delhi, Mumbai are has huge attractiveness for people to go and work there because of the opportunities. But after the pandemic, there are serious concerns that some people would be avoiding such bigger cities and try to live in smaller cities where density of population might be much lower. Now, what's the global impact? As Ronita just mentioned, is the promotion of remote work, which is a great change, but at the same time, it has great downsides as well. What about outsourcing? If companies can encourage people to work from home, then it also leads to more outsourcing of jobs. So what's the difference between working from home in New York versus working from home in New Delhi or working from home in Shanghai? So we'll be seeing those kind of outsourcing businesses picking up because of if work from home picks up. Another interesting thing would be, in my opinion, would be a reduction in domestic and international migration. Those both internal and outside migration would be going down because people would be very afraid to move around. And also, I don't know how many people would be supportive of the fact or welcoming to people who are coming from outside if the pandemic stays on. Obviously, there will be supply chain disruptions. It can promote geographic diversification production process. Already we are talking about moving production processes from more affected countries to less affected countries. If that happens, that can have serious impact on countries which relied on this kind of supplying or feeding these supply chains. And we don't know yet, but we'll see how this kind of evolves. And finally, there will be some increase in certain kind of services like home delivery. That will again pick up at a global scale. And these are some of the major disruptions we are looking at the global level. Now let me focus a little bit on the policy responses. So what are the policies you can take? And I'm going to divide policy responses into short-term and long-term policies because the issues, some can be sorted out in a short-term basis, some can be sorted out in a longer-term basis. So short-term policies, first thing would be stabilize the aggregate demand because you have to provide steady income to the workers, those who are sitting at home, perhaps unable to work remotely. For example, give them generous unemployment benefits, direct tax, cash transfers, or guaranteed employment programs like NREGA in India. For example, already I heard that Indian government is opening up NREGA, allowing people to give 100 days of guaranteed work. That will stabilize the demand side. That will avoid the food crisis perhaps we are going to face, and Nilanjan touched upon those points. Second, not only supporting the workers, you need to support the business because businesses have their bills to pay. They have to pay rent, they have to pay interest on their loans. So provide a low-cost credit lines to these businesses and make sure they don't go bankrupt, at least in the short run, because you need these businesses to be come in force when the economy opens up and if we can control this pandemic. And finally, it's about the balancing the risk between possible infection with gradual opening of the economy, as Prasun mentioned. Like, we need to make sure that this infection, risk is that if we open up too early and too fast, it might adversely impact the possibility of the second round of infections, which can be even more dangerous. What about longer term policies? I think longer term policies has to be at a more global level. First, create a long cross-national institutions to tackle such pandemics. We need to strengthen WHO, World Health Organization, but there are talks about, at least in the US, where they are talking about who is not doing the job, we should kind of defund them. That's not the right time. we need to come together and make these cross-national institutions much more effective in tackling the pandemic. And also institute a longer-term policy like universal basic income to absorb such shocks. Because if these things are happening, there's no doubt some other virus may come in future, and we should be prepared for those situations. And universal basic income, or as Prasun mentioned, universal healthcare, can help to tamp down the effects of these shocks. Here's some conclusions. So obviously this is a world, we haven't seen a pandemic of this scale for almost 100 years. Last one was the Spanish flu of 1918. But what we know historically, often pandemics like COVID can lead to a drastic change or shift in the way we interact in societies, especially in the labor market. And the concerning part is that we don't know a lot about this effects of this virus yet. And I think moving forward is that we need to encourage more informed policy discussions or decisions. We should be relying more on data. We should be relying more on experts to get more detailed understanding of this virus and maybe future pandemics also, so that we can tackle it at a much better level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arindam. It was a wonderful presentation, and if you can stop sharing your screen.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So, thank you once again, Arindam. And due to the paucity of time, what we will do is we'll take a few questions. And, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. So due to the paucity of time, let me repeat real quick that I will take a few questions. And the first question that has been asked is for Ronita. Ronita, am I audible?
Oh, yes, I can hear you.
Great. So the question has been asked by Mr. Rupam Das, who is the Vice President at JP Morgan Chase at London. And he asks, lot of entrepreneurial investment happens to reach mostly the first world and the affluent segment. After COVID, will this investment, which I think will be more limited, be diversified to reach fundamental research and science? Or will it be more focused to consumer-driven product for a faster return on investment?
Okay, am I visible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, fantastic question. I think we're all trying to see what the investment markets are looking at and how they're going to develop further. Of course, a lot of money is being divested towards healthcare right now. Healthcare solutions, access to healthcare, broadening that out. I think, of course, we're going to continue to see that as long as this pandemic continues. Yeah, so I think this is a question on innovation and answering the call of problems that we're seeing. I think I personally hypothesize that there's actually going to be a strong amount of investment going into supply chains. And so entrepreneurs, startups, whether it's first world or, you know, whatever that means anymore, right? But whether it's India, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's even in the US, it is going to be, I think the investment money is going to be flowing much more towards strengthening supply chains, digitizing supply chain, inventory management. We're going to see a lot more B2B than consumer right now. I think until uncertainty comes to a halt, until there is some certainty in the world, people will not be consuming as much. I think people are realizing right now how much less you can actually consume. So I think consumer is going to be tremendously struggling, but I do think digitization, formalizing in informal areas, and building B2B and digitizing supply chains are going to be the areas for investment.
Thank you so much, Ronita. Thank you so much. The second question is for Nilanjan. And the question goes as follows. We are already seeing the plight of migrant workers in India. And of course, as we all know, they are the worst affected. So Dr. Abhijit Banerjee has just recently said that India has not done anything close to enough to help the poor. So what do you think the Indian government should do to save the poor, especially during the lockdown and beyond? This is a question for Nilanjan. Nilanjan, are you there?
Am I audible now?
Yeah, you are audible. Did you get the question, or do you?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, please.
So basically, I think we have in front of us the wisdom model, which people are talking about, where the government is taking a proactive role in terms of supplying the necessities in terms of food, grain, and public distribution thing, be it wheat, rice, pulse to the affected parties. And something what has already been touched upon is I would like to see the NREGA program being up and running, because that's the basic from where you start. And there have been some papers which show that the impact of NREGA on consumption expenditure has been positive. So what the government can do is ensure that the food grain are being distributed properly through the public distribution system. B, ensure that there are enough number of scheme like NREGA which are up and running so that this group of people can go and participate. Remember, these are at the district, at the village level, right? So most of the migrant workers have gone back to their own village. So if you have some scheme like NREGA being operated in those villages, it's going to definitely help these poor people. And C, ensure that these people are getting some kind of insurance benefit, be it in the form of getting money from the government or be it getting this thing from the public distribution system. So that's in short.
Thank you, Nilanjan. And we have around 5 more minutes. And I have one question for Prasun and one question for Arindam. So let me start off with Prasun. Can you hear us, Prasun?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. And this question comes from Mr. Projjal Guha, who is a senior manager with Deloitte Consulting. And his question is as follows. How does the behavioral change, within parentheses, not frequenting to malls, restaurants, pubs, or lesser pleasure/business travel post-pandemic will result into long-term demand lost? And what is the most important impact to short-term economy at the local as well as the global scale?
Okay, so let me break down the questions. So the first one is how this distancing and travel will affect the long-term.
A drastic drop in the visits to the mall, pubs, etc., traveling will result into long-term demand lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big problem that we are going to face, and as a lot of the speakers have already said, that there might be some shifts in occupations that way, because airlines are already talking about, I mean, probably keeping their middle seats empty as they resume travel. Mm-hmm. So we don't know, and you have seen the price of oil where it has gone because of the airlines are sitting idle. So that will be a very challenging thing to see. I mean, we see all this growth of, I mean, malls and so on in India in recent years. So we don't know whether this kind of economy is sustainable anymore. I mean, it's a very consumer-driven economy at this point of time, but we don't know how this FMCG sectors and things like that will move. I mean, that will be a, thing to watch out for, that how we can recover this. I mean, I won't say they're non-essential, but they're obviously the so-called fast-moving consumer sector. So it's yet to be seen. And as I said before, this damage might be immense. And that might also lead to some structural shifts in the economy, And what was the other question?
Yeah, the second question, Prasun, is, give me 1 second, and what is the most prominent impact to short-term economy at the local and global scale?
Possible economic impact in the short term.
short-term as well as long-term, and short-term at local and global scale. I'm sorry.
Global scales, still, I think what has happened is the lockdowns are not as much, enforced as it has happened in India. So looks like the damage might not be as much in the US. For example, a lot of drive-thrus are open in fast food restaurants, and some businesses are, open. I mean, it's not like a lockdown like we're seeing in India. And people are also said to maintain social distance, but they're allowed to move. So I think that short-term damage we'll see more in a local scale than on a global level. And also, but in India also, you can see one more thing, which is the brighter picture, on the contrary speaking, that we have a lot of, informal sector kind of labor market as well. So you see a lot of this vegetable sellers who are coming from neighborhood to neighborhood to sell vegetables. So it's not only a formal market structure too. So on the contrary, there's a good news as well in the local scale, that although we have a more stricter enforcement of the lockdown, but since we have an informal labor market and it's not all formalized, so the impact, some of the impact can be mitigated that way, I think.
Okay, thank you so much, Prasun. And we have time for one more question, and this question is directed to Arindam. And Arindam, the question comes from Mr. Muhammad Ilahi, and the question is as follows. Is it related to geopolitics of COVID-19? Or it is related, I'm sorry, the question is related to the geopolitics of COVID-19. So every crisis has some winners and some losers. Some experts are predicting that China would emerge stronger in the global arena at the expense of US. So what are your thoughts on this, is the question. So what are your thoughts that China would emerge stronger in the global arena at the expense of US post-COVID-19?
Yeah, thank you for this questions. And I think it's not the time to kind of like predict about the geopolitics at this point of time, because this is a world crisis. And the fact is that if US stops consuming, Chinese factories doesn't run them. That's the fact. That's the reality. Has China done better than US? There are a lot of doubts about that. Because it doesn't matter where it starts, it's now is a pandemic, which essentially means it's a global scale problem. And we all need to come together as part of this world citizenship, that we need to all play our role to stop it. Having said that, will there be some winners and some losers? We don't know yet. And I don't want to predict on that at this point of time, because it's just simply not enough information, I would say. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Arindam. And we have questions that are flooding in, but as I said, due to the time limitations, we have to stop the questions right here. We are taking note of all the questions, and we'll ensure that we forward the questions to the respective speakers and so that they can reply to the persons who asked those questions. So before winding up, let me express, or on behalf of the Center of Asia Pacific Business Research, Economics and Innovation, let me express my profuse gratitude and thank you to the four speakers, Ronita, Nilanjan, Prasun and Arindam, for taking time off on a Saturday evening and Saturday morning for Prasun and Arindam to come and deliver some wonderful talks to us. Their talk, the session was indeed extremely informative and rich and gave us a 360-degree view of the crisis. The talk definitely, in addition to scaring us a little more, also helped us to understand how to navigate challenges during this difficult time and the need for appropriate and quick response, be it defensive, be it offensive, be it resiliency, be it testing and whatnot. So it was an absolute privilege for us to host you on this platform. And as a director of this center, I hope to host you all again. And this webinar won't be complete without me thanking the center members, especially Dr. Chitrakalpa Sen, Dr. Anuj Kapoor, Chitresh Kumar, Shubhamoy Banerjee, for their relentless effort that they put in arranging this seminar. Basically, I almost did nothing to arrange the seminar. It was everything done by the center members, and I really owe them on behalf of the center big time for doing this, especially, as I mentioned right at the beginning, Chitrakalpa and Anuj. I also wish to thank all the audience who have joined today, and I hope you will join us for future webinars as well. In this context, let me say that this is first of a series of webinars that the Center for Asia Pacific Business Research, Economics and Innovations are planning to host over the next couple of months or so. So keep your eyes on the center's website for more information. And if you have any question, please send us an email. And our emails are listed on the slide that I will exhibit right now, so that you can take a look at it and, if necessary, copy the email. So once again, on behalf of the Center of Asia Pacific Business Research, Economics and Innovation, it was a pleasure hosting the speakers. It was a pleasure hosting this webinar. And I hope this is just the beginning of a multiple series of webinars that we intend to come up with.